Hello. I have the most unpronounceable name in the world. My name is Tadhg Kelly. I'm a game designer. I've written a blog called What Games Are for a couple of years. And most recently, I've joined into the VR, I guess, hyper-apocalypse by working for VREAL as the director of developer relations. So I'm working with a lot of people who are making funky, crazy VR games.
It's just live straight up. Hi, my name's Peter Akemann. I'm presently president of the newly formed Skydance Interactive, part of the Skydance media family. Prior to that, we ran as the workshop, an independent game dev studio for the last 8 years, and prior to that, was a co-founder of Treyarch way back in the day. We're very excited about this new partnership with Skydance that has given us the opportunity and funding to be able to seriously attack the next wave of VR that we see coming. That is VR that involves motion control for the hands. Though I'd say more broadly, seeing trying to bring immersive action storytelling experiences to a new level that would never have been possible without this platform. So we're very excited to be here at this time and jumping in.
My name is Paul Bettner. I'm the founder and CEO at PLAYFUL. We are a relatively new company, 3 years old. And we have been working on VR games for the last several years. We're one of maybe the first third-party developer to work with Oculus. We worked on a game with them called Lucky's Tale that is the game that ended up being bundled with the Oculus Rift, a third-person character action game. This is Lucky on my shirt. We now have 50 people working on VR games across several different platforms. We're very focused on, I think VR and AR can create a lot of different emotions. We want to create happiness, so that's what we're working on with our products.
I wanted to just start things off just kind of as a VR game developer, I sort of see this decision you have to make up front, like what platform you're going to target, because you have mobile VR where you could just have positional tracking and maybe a 3-degree of freedom controller, but those constraints are different from a desktop VR with an Xbox controller, and those are different from a room scale with like full motion track controllers. And there's either, Akemann and Akemann tell me that you can either innovate of 2 of those 3, of motion track controllers, Xbox controller, and innovative game design. You can only have 2 of those at the same time, and it's hard to do all 3 of those because you end up doing some of the lowest common denominator. So I'm just curious to hear some of your experiences of kind of navigating that landscape in terms of VR design.
So for us, we approach each of those platforms very differently. There's definitely the approach you alluded to of targeting the least common denominator. But the platforms are so different. I mean, what they can do well and what's interesting about them is just, it's not just different because of the control scheme, it's different because of venue. In the case of mobile VR, at least here in the West, I think that the sort of venue that people consume content on mobile VR is very different than kind of sitting down with your PC and putting on this thing. And so even the length of the experiences and the expectations that the consumers have for those experiences is different. Not just the way they control, but at least from a game design standpoint, there's nothing, in my mind, more fundamental to the design of the game than how the controls work. So we've just taken an approach of sort of disconnecting those things and saying, look, if we're making a game for Daydream, it's going to be a game for Daydream. And that frees us to make, I think, better design decisions.
I think I alluded to this in my entryway. I would wholly agree that the platform spectrum in VR is extremely variable, both in the mechanical controls and the whole use case, the way players are going to be, whether they're moving, traveling around, tethered, having to have very expensive equipment or very cheap equipment. It could just radically affect what you're aiming for. We see, just from our own interactions with VR, that this next wave of product with the Oculus Touch controllers coming and the PSVR coming is that there is, I won't call it, there's not a lowest common denominator, but a denominator amongst the Vive, Oculus with Touch and PSVR with Move controllers that is what we would call fully immersive first-person VR with the headset and the hands. And that to us is a big enough target that we're going after it with gusto right now. Now, over time, of course, we'll go more broad, but as people just diving in, we're quite focused on that platform. I think it's going to be broad enough that we can invest deep resources in it and produce some really amazing things there.
Even across those platforms, though, it's interesting. You know, the ones you mentioned, Sony PlayStation VR, Vive, and Oculus Touch. They have a certain level of commonality, but depending on the kind of experience you want to create, there can even be fragmentation there because PlayStation requires, or I mean implies, I believe it requires a face-forward VR experience. The Vive encourages a full 360 turnaround, and Oculus is kind of unknown right now which direction they're going to go. And so even that has a least common denominator to it. If you want to target all three of them, then you have to make design decisions that are around basically the PlayStation VR as the least common denominator of those types of experiences.
I think that's fair, but I think that's going to be a broad and very important use case.
Yeah, absolutely. VR. Yes.
No, we're not going to be leveraging every element of those platforms. And certainly the room scale is going to remain Vive's alone. Yeah. And even where Oculus can get close to that, it's really not, the tech is just not fundamentally built for it, and certainly PSVR is committed to that. But we think that's it's the lowest common denominator, but among a high echelon. So we think it's going to be profound.
It's interesting because that's, I think, what happens across the platforms. Like if you target seated controller-based VR, you get to ship on Vive, Oculus, PSVR, potentially even a Gear VR headset if somebody's buying a controller for it. But as you start to step up that scale and you start to, and the highest requirement, I think, being the full turnaround experience, and really only one platform supports that. So yeah, it's not just about hardware, I guess. It's also about the types of experiences.
So I think one of those three, in fairness, is kind of turning out to be the redheaded stepchild, which is a lot of people kind of feel that the controller-y version of VR is kind of a transition at best. And for the most part, everybody, I think, expects that VR, whether it be mobile or console or PC or if there's ever Mac VR or whatever, it will involve a certainly arm motion, right? And it will involve that kind of like pincer mandible sort of thing. I mean, even not to say even, but the Google Daydream sort of single controller is kind of aiming for that to a little bit. Although apparently they're not going to allow two controllers, but we'll sort of see how that goes. But certainly that sort of like degree of motion away from and sort of like relative position to where the head is and where the face is, that seems to be, roughly speaking, what VR is kind of shaping up to be. And then, yeah, the kind of the greater degree of body motion that sort of comes with that, whether it's full 360 or whether it's room scale or that kind of thing is kind of turning out to be something of a philosophical question. Because the market itself is far too small, I think, to try and cover all the bases, and you don't want to be in a position where your game is, I guess, trying to hit all of the VR headsets all at once and therefore being the kind of crappiest that it can be. It's too small to sort of worry about that. What you really should be aiming for, in my opinion, is one good target that you know is what you're aiming for, and you're going to make the best experience within that particular platform. And then the hope is that then generates a lot of buzz for your studio, say, or generates a lot of attention around your excellent experience that you've created. So it's kind of that sort of choice, I think, at the moment. It's not so much how do I mangle my game to fit into every kind of VR. It's how do I figure the right VR platform and then potentially mangle it later on if I need to.
So, yeah.
So
our game is a controller-based seated VR experience. So, this is a fascinating point. We think about all the time, and we actually have stuff in development that is continuing to be controller-based for future products, as well as stuff that we're doing in room scale and touch-based VR. And it's an active debate within our studio. It's obviously an active debate in the industry. The way it seems to me is that video game controllers, the type of thing connected to your Xbox or your PlayStation, no doubt are a barrier to players. My wife looks at that controller. It's got 16 buttons. It just looks like this intimidating device that she's never going to learn how to use and is not interested in using, and therefore she cannot enjoy the experiences that I do on PlayStation and Xbox. And for me, I'm fascinated in things that lower those barriers, that expand the audience. That said, those controllers are highly evolved instruments for being able to sit back, relax, not have to move your body, twitch your fingers, and have a giant result because you're just twitching your thumb, And I'm not really convinced that that's going to go anywhere. Like that's that's a powerful notion, and something that for me as a consumer, and I can just speak from that standpoint, is not something like I'm going to continue to seek after products that present that experience even when I have motion controlled stuff. And so, and the other thing is, when I've tried the best experience for controller based is the PlayStation tracked controller, the PS4 controller that actually tracks and moves. So when you're using the PlayStation VR, you see the controller sitting there and you pick it up and they can change the controller into different things, and like little robots come out of the controller and all these great experiences. It's a wonderful thing. Like as a consumer, it's something that I want. So I just don't see one supplanting the other. There's arguments either way about which segment of that audience is going to be larger or not. Arguments against that nobody really wants to stand up ultimately and jump around like crazy, and counter arguments to, yeah, but it's really where the compelling experiences exist in VR. Who knows?
Yeah, the way that I think about it is that when you go into VR, you're essentially taking away all the different ways that we feel present in the real world, and you're adding them in one by one back into that. So from my mind, there's 4 different types of presence, and I think just to kind of elaborate, one of the points that you were trying to make, Tadhg, is that I do think that embodied presence is one dimension of presence. So you're actually trying to focus on making the player feel like they're present within the experience. And then there's an active presence where you're actually physically doing some sort of action. I think that's where the controller base really comes in, where you're kind of doing these abstracted actions that you're exerting your will into the world. Something like Job Simulator is another example where you just get so lost in what you're doing. And then I think there's social presence that happens when you're actually engaging with other people in an experience. And then finally there's an emotional presence, which I think that's where storytelling can start to come in. So I see that the experiences that are going to be really successful are trying to add multiple different dimensions of those presence, but some of those are actually in conflict with each other. For example, the active and embodied presence can be going against emotional presence, because the more that you focus on your agency and interactivity with an experience, the less that you actually can be receiving a story. It's sort of like the classic debate between receiving a story and participating interactively within a game. So just some thoughts that I have on how I think about that there's these different dimensions of presence, and how by deciding which one you're going to focus on, you can that's going to impact how you actually design your game.
Another way to think about it too is think about Pong. That game was effectively simulating table tennis, right? Well, table tennis existed, so you could go play table tennis in the best version of virtual reality ever, which was reality. You could play real table tennis, right? But lazy people like me kind of want to just sit down and use my thumbs to play table tennis in a Pong-like game, and so then this entire video game industry takes root, where a lot of the types of experiences you're having as you sit on your couch are simulating things that you could just go outside and do if you wanted to, but you don't, because you want to sit down on your couch after a long day of work. And I just see that, VR is, that same thing should happen again. There's nothing different about the human nature that led to that in the first place.
So I think I actually am quite a big fan of what the Rift's touch controllers are shaping up to be, because I think there's, not to take it away from Valve, I actually really like the Vive controllers as well, but they're more like of a specific use case. But what I like about the Rift controllers is they have thought a lot about kind of button usage. Yeah. They've thought a lot about that. Actually, there's several kind of switches underneath my thumb, which is effectively the same as a joypad, and there's little kind of gesture controllers, which
it's really the best of both worlds.
Right, but you can kind of lounge with them and but you can also move your arms around, and you can also kind of tilt and stuff, and so it feels like that. If we're talking about degrees of abstraction, I think you still get to have your cake and eat it in that sort of sense. Like there is going to be, and there is clearly room for that level of abstract interaction, but it's not, I think, attached to joypads as we understand them today.
I'll just throw a word on that. I learned some hard lessons on this very front. We worked on Sorcery for Sony, which is the PlayStation Move game. That was a huge investment in getting people to get up there, and if I start doing it, I'll lose my mic, but I'll do it with my left hand. Play this very interactive game. I gave a talk actually at a GDC about the lazy gamer, and what we've all been sold about motion gaming and what the truth was, right? The slot, like what we are the other 99%, right? It's like, yeah, it's great those kids are going to get up and dance like that. You find that real players play your game in the laziest possible way, and yet, and so I definitely hear that in the evolution, or the power of and importance of what a game controller does, without a doubt, absolutely profound thing, and highly underappreciated. But what I'll say is, if you're delivering a VR experience that's ultimately just a widescreen version of a 2D standard experience, I think we've missed the boat. And those moments that do get you up off your butt, get your arms up off the armrest of the couch, that littlest thing in sorcery when you had to drink a potion, you couldn't just press the drink button, you had to shake it up and tilt it back into your mouth. And that took an action which would have been mundane and trivial and meaningless, a total throwaway action in another game, and made it something that swept the audience when we demoed that thing on the stage at E3 in 2010 with the charm. And it had just the same charm to any player who was actually doing it, these moments of interaction, shooting an arrow by reaching to your back to grab it off. There's no need to do that. You could have just had the arrow draw button. But things that pull you into the experience emotionally, connect the player to their avatar, to the fantasy that you're delivering as a game maker, because your point is to give pull the player deep into an immersive experience beyond their real life, and that's the magic of video games in the first place. So, I think if motion control didn't catch on the first time, I think it's found its home in VR without a doubt. The first time I put on a VR helm, I was reaching into the world, and everybody does it. Watch anybody put one on, and they're already reaching for things. There's no system to detect that. And another one there is voice. They start speaking to virtual characters, put a character in front of you. You'll talk to it. There's no system actually listening yet. But those natural interfaces that you bring with you into VR, you feel like you do, are just so compelling. I think though there's going to be plenty of time spent on the armrests just for ergonomic reasons of people pressing their buttons. That's always going to be a part of it, which is why I think the spatial tracking of just hands alone is not going to be there. I think the controllers are critical. But I think those elements that draw us into the virtual world for real are the things that are going to uniquely drive the platform, drive the romance, because I think that's the essence of the romance of the whole enterprise and what's giving it reason to exist. And if we lose sight of that, we're missing the boat as designers.
I so completely agree with that. I just think it's incredible because over the last 3 years, I found myself constantly on both sides of this. It's probably just because people like a war, they want one side to win versus the other and whatever, and so there's always this, it's all going to be about motion controllers, or no, nobody's going to stand up and do that thing, it's all going to be about seated experiences. There's legitimate arguments on both sides. I found myself a year ago, as I was trying to talk about how incredible I thought the Vive was and how I thought we should get a Vive project going, and I'm fighting against this contingent of people saying, look, the Wiimote, the Wii, people, all they did is they ended up sitting down on their couch and just doing this with the Wiimote. Then they're not standing up, and so it's a failure. Yeah, and it's like, guys, that's not, as you said, when you're in VR and you actually see your hands, it has nothing to do with the Wiimote experience. Completely different thing, right? And so that comparison is invalid, in my opinion. But it was being used to defend how that market would never take off. And then,
Right. And there is an element, I think, of hesitation with a lot of developers on this kind of stuff, because they have been through the years of motion control before, and the Kinect and all that sort of stuff. And so they are kind of drawing, I think, a clear line from one to the next. But when you've played something like Space Pirate Trainer and you've actually physically dodged bullets by yourself and realized that's a thing you can do, it's kind of like, oh no, hang on, this is totally different. Like, this is not the same thing as me like looking at my sad, flabby self exercising on a television. This is like I'm actually in a space, and the range of what I'm doing is a whole lot more superbly realized than what I've ever been able to do before. So, and that's when the switch flips for me. You're like, yep, okay, this is going to be the whole thing.
So right now, I think it's still pretty early days in VR. There's a lot of games that are completely unique to VR. So I like to look at those games that totally would not work in a 2D game and start to extrapolate some of the things that really work for that. So I'd sort of pose the question of some of these emerging genres that are coming out. What do you see as kind of the VR game design and mechanics that you think really work and are worth kind of pointing out?
Well, so I have a kind of a brief list, actually, of a couple of games that I think, if people haven't played them, that they should, because they're just really good for some individual kind of mechanical lessons that they're teaching. It's not necessarily the case that these are the best games of VR kind of ever or anything like that, but they're just like, as I've been playing them, I'm like, yeah, you should take note of that. A good example is the helmet action in Fantastic Contraption, where you sort of put it on to effectively bring up the menu. It's like the most wonderfully small gesture, but when you do it a few times, you're like, I could just do this all day. I could do this all day, and it's a really good example of how it pulls you presently into the world and really makes you feel that you're you're kind of a part of it. There's a game called Cosmic Trip, which has done something very simple with its interfaces as well, where it's just bringing up these dashboards sort of in the world, and you're kind of like pushing a button like that and pushing a button like that to bring up a menu, just like do a thing like that. And again, the physical interactive kind of quality of that is something that's small, but it's wonderful, and it really kind of makes you forget that you're kind of gaming in a sort of a formal sense. You know, it's that sort of kind of blood-brain barrier kind of crossover sort of stuff. There's a bunch of others as well. I mean, have you played games like the Brookhaven Experiment? You like standy shooty type stuff, but it's really good fun, and it's amazing when you realize that things are coming at you from all directions. The kind of 360ness of it is quite something. The game Rec Room, which is new, which is a kind of a Wii Sportsy sort of thing. And that's just what I played. I met up to visit those guys recently. We played like frisbee for a couple of hours, just literally, boo. You're like, oh, go do frisbee golf kind of stuff, and threw darts at each other in the locker room kind of area, because that's a thing you can do. And probably one that I've been really impressed with recently is a game called Snow Fortress, which is literally a snowball fight, right? Where you like grab little blocks and you put them up in front of you, like, and then you and some like evil-looking snowman are just like pitching snowballs at each other back and forth. You're throwing with your Vive controller. I've nearly broken the Vive controller in our office a few times because it's like, and it's amazing, and it's such a wonderfully simple, casual game, but it's teaching me so much about sort of simple interaction, and that kind of like pull me in sort of joy, you know. It's not particularly logistic, it's not really very complicated, and it's not trying to convey a complicated idea at me, but the sheer joy of being able to do this is something that I've never experienced before. And so those are the kinds of things for me. Design-wise, I actually think that there's a huge amount to be said for a return to a very deep simplicity in approach to games, and a very deep sort of think of it as though we have just invented the mouse. And it's not like sort of 20 years on and everybody knows how to use hotkeys and everybody knows how to sort of right click and everybody knows how to use like all those crazy extra buttons that they keep putting on Logitech mouses and stuff like that. We're in that phase of like, oh my hand will click. That's amazing. I could do this, you know. And that's where we are with a lot of VR, and it's wonderful. Like it's so transformationally strange compared to what we've been doing for the longest time. And yet, it's incredibly robust as well. There's so much that can be done with it, but there's a strong argument to be made for ensuring that we approach it in a very delicate and simple fashion first, and actually spend a lot of time exploring the easy things, the little things, the mild things, rather than maybe sort of trying to go all the way into, I don't know, making Doom for VR or something, which might be asking too much of the audience at this point. Not that Doom's not great, but so yeah.
You guys have any thoughts?
I agree with everything you just said. I think what's interesting about that is that, I mean, I'm having the same experience as you. I download, new experiences on Steam every week, and there's always something to be extracted from the design of each of those things. Even the small indie things are discovering new like fundamentally new mechanics. Like you said, like this is how a mouse click should work or something like that. And it's so incredibly valuable for any of you that are doing work in this space. Of course, I highly recommend you do the same. And you need a Vive in this case because this stuff is happening right now primarily on Steam, and primarily with motion controls. To your point, and we have a controller-based game, there's not nearly as much innovation as I expect to happen in that space because there's been so much exploration around what a controller can do, and it's why we were drawn to doing a platforming game, because if you put a controller in my hand, that's what I want to do generally, and I don't have a lot of questions of, oh, what can this thing do that's never been done before? It's a controller. I know the things it can do. But these motion control, when it's perfectly tracked motion controls, which is, the world has never seen that type of thing before, the language is like I said, every week I'm learning new words.
Yeah, I guess I would generally. This is not a controversial point. I think I agree with both of the things that you're saying. I want to call out. As you dive into motion control, you realize you're diving into this vastly multidimensional space where nothing is defined what a player is going to do. We used to joke that everybody presses X in the same way, but you tell them to do something, and who knows what they're going to do. How they're going to react to the elements that are presented to you. So I think it is a period of enormous discovery on what works. One of the ones that totally astonished me working was the climb. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to see that in terms of things that I would have thought would be a total disaster. would have just been a vomit fest, would have been, you know, non-intuitive about where your hands were going, and yet produce this stable, beautiful, incredibly exciting, and utterly immersive experience. And though I missed playing the touch version of that at E3, the guys in my office who did say it's astonishing, even though I'd had an argument with them about why that wasn't going to work on touch, and I was totally wrong.
You know,
so
the way that works,
yeah.
it's really interesting. There's some physiological thing happening there. In some experiments we've done, when you're able to use your hands to walk, because it's not tracking your feet, so you can't, I mean, you can move around a room scale, but you run up to the edges. But like walking on your hands effectively, your brain is like, okay, I'll accept that. and it alleviates motion sickness. It's the strangest thing.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just ask one last question, and then there's a little bit of extra time. It goes to like 5:15 technically, so we can ask some questions from the audience. So I wanted to just bring up Pokemon Go and look at that Pokemon Go from the perspective of, you know, I realize that it's pretty limited in terms of the augmented reality that's happening now. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts in terms of projecting out, you know, 5 years in the future, and what Pokemon Go can teach VR and what VR could teach the future of augmented reality gaming.
Well, one thing I want to say about Pokemon Go that's kind of a takeaway maybe for folks in this audience is that Pokemon Go could have existed for the last 5 years. In fact, I mean, the company that made it created Ingress, and that is a game that's existed. But what it shows me, though, is that, you know, getting in now to VR and AR is great, and obviously we believe in it, but it's not critical. You know, the power of brands and the power of having a great idea as this medium evolves, there will be, you know, just the most incredible products that come out 5 years from now that aren't shown right now. But Pokemon, what happened there, it in my mind, and the cultural phenomenon, the literally changing society thing that's happened here in the West with that game, it's just a taste of what's going to happen in 5, 6, 7 years when AR is a mass market device. I mean, it's impossible to sort of even envision ourselves what that'll look like for all of us that are kind of aware of this space and what's happening. I don't think even we can picture what's coming.
So I kind of have a completely contrary attitude on AR and Pokemon Go and stuff like that. I feel there's an interesting kind of movement, if you like, within certain parts of the industry to say that like VR is like a transition and AR is kind of the real deal and stuff like that. But every time I try and think about a kind of a substantial use for AR, I always end up kind of going, it seems all right. It kind of turns into Skype on a wall or something along those kinds of lines. And with games like Pokemon Go, it's kind of, I mean, is it really bad to say I'm bored of it? Like sorry, I know it's
so over Pokemon Go.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like I'm kind of like, okay, fine. I can walk to places and I can like pick up stuff and I can flick a ball kind of at a thing, and that's cool. And I sort of see why it's fun. But I never was a Poke child, so I never really was like, oh my god, it's a Pokemon kind of thing. And it seems like the whole of the rest. To me, it seems the whole of the rest of the world has kind of temporarily lost its mind, with some sort of nostalgia for its kind of youth. I personally look at it and I think, yeah, but VR is going to be richer. Do you know what I mean? Like the kind of the easier, more, I guess, like immersive, ensorcel me in a world stuff, is, for me at least, is far more interesting. The things we talked a little bit earlier about, for example, I'm hugely impressed by social communication within VR. I'm massively, massively impressed about how easy it is for people to sort of express themselves within a VR environment, with avatars and with all that sort of, and with simple like gestural kind of hand controls and just being able to like kind of really be a part of this whole other world, right? I think of that and I think of AR and I'm like, I don't know what the argument is for why I need AR over and above that. For me, it seems like we've kind of hit the magic place kind of already, and so I'm like, I'm with it, right? I don't know why I want to bring the real world into it again. So it's that's a very personally whatever view, but it's yeah, I just kind of don't care that much. I really want just to stay focused within the virtual version of reality for quite a long time and see what we can do with that.
I think if you look at the market, it's pretty clear that AR is like definitely going to be bigger than VR in terms of just there's so much more use cases and there's so many more situations where it's actually a huge social taboo to kind of block off your eyes from being socially present with other people, and that's why, fundamentally, why AR is going to be bigger. I mean, you could just look at the success of Pokemon Go and say right there that AR is bigger than a lot of the biggest VR experiences that we're going to see. So I just think that there's so many more industrial use cases, and it allows us to be socially present in the real world at the same time and going into the virtual world. And so I think that there's a lot of the cutting edge 3D UI and human-computer interactions that's being developed in VR. It's definitely a few years ahead of where AR is going to be, but I really see that a lot of those principles that are played out within and developed and cultivated within VR are going to be applied to AR, and we're just going to be wearing AR glasses all the time. It's going to replace all of our computer screens, replace looking at our phone, and interface with the Internet of Things. And to me, I think it's like no question that it's going to be way bigger than VR.
Same here.
Kind of, it's funny to compare them apart from the fact that they share some similar technology, or highly related technology, and they both have R at the end of it in our two-letter acronyms. R. They're like, as especially AR, as we're now seeing it, as Pokemon Go has essentially redefined the term for everybody, much to the chagrin of the VR people working in their light field trapping, technology, and saying, "Damn it, that's not real VR." The Grinches of VR owners trying to figure out why the Who's and Whoville are having such a damn good time with it when none of what's actually important to Christmas is there. But I mean, it's okay. I ran that metaphor a little too far, but so I see, if you look at the experiences, it's like polar opposite. You got people running around in the park on one end, interacting with each other, and then you've got the world, in some ways the world's most social game that's ever been, and then probably the most antisocial experience you could possibly do: strap yourself into this helm, cover your ears, cover your eyes, be in a dark room, tethered to something. It's like, go away, don't even have somebody near me, or I'm probably going to punch you in the face by mistake, not knowing you're there. So how do these two worlds even communicate? And it's an interesting question, and my sort of weird sideways thought about it was presence. Presence is the magic word of VR. Like immersion was just too weak, too overused a word. They had to come up with a new word because what we were experiencing in VR was so strong. And it occurs to me that what was, to me, the most profound thing about Pokemon Go was that very same word was presence, but presence with other people. It was like suddenly the player base, I was part of a phenomenon and a player base where I actually saw the other people who were playing the game. It wasn't just a number of users that was on the thing or some people in a store. It was like, oh my God, I'm there, and here are these other guys that are here playing this game. So the lesson, the sort of sideways or possibility that put to me in the VR space is when we learn to take the presence power of VR and let us be present with other people, that when we can create a VR experience that lets me encounter a crowd of other people who are in that VR space, not like an MMO where I've got my mouse and keyboard, maybe I can do a dance or I can play a couple of animations, but with the full expressive power of my hands and my face, just the enormous socially expressive power that VR gives to us. I think the moment we have something there where we can replicate that experience in a VR environment, we're going to have a similar, another, well, I think it's another nuclear bomb waiting to go off, much as this was.
Maybe a love bomb. Let's do that.
Sure, the good kind, right?
Yeah, I mean, to use your example against you a little bit, the thing that you were talking about around the social VR experience being so incredibly compelling, which I agree with, but when that same avatar or whatever my friend is being represented as can just materialize on my couch and I don't have to go in, but it's just in my living room, that's even more
I mean, I don't mean to sound like the negative Grinch of Grinchtown, but what I'm trying to get at is this. There's nothing wrong with the idea that computing and the real world kind of cross over. What I'm trying to get at, though, is that I'm not at all embarrassed by the idea of being, I guess, kind of into a virtual world in the same way as I'm not at all embarrassed by the idea that I might sit down and use my computer for 10 hours. I don't actually agree that just because it's sort of all dominating that's a bad thing or that's somehow kind of a weakness. I actually think it's a strength. I think that the fact that VR can really kind of completely take over your attention is a powerful, powerful thing. And so for me, I think that's where most of the actually deep use cases will come from, because it facilitates concentration. Whereas with AR, it's like mobile phone on a bus kind of games and stuff. Yeah, there's a really strong argument to be made for like that additive layer of life kind of stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't actually personally believe that it will see a lot of deeper uses for a very long time. Whereas I do think with VR, you'll actually get to that point much more quickly. There'll be a lot of things like productivity applications in building 3D models of, I don't know, virtual worlds or motorbikes or whatever, that actually may work much better in a concentrated VR environment than, say, also trying to encounter the fact that I'm in a physical office and so that's where I'm trying to get at it, is that it's not like we're kind of halfway on the road to an overall AR world, and VR is kind of a stepping stone to that. I think VR itself is actually an incredibly powerful thing.
I seem to continue to sense this feeling across the industry that the two paths, VR and AR, will be looked at as separate things. But it just seems to me that in 5 or 6 years, the only difference will be categories on an app store, not fundamentally different devices or platforms. There's I was talking to somebody about this the other day. There's convergence happening in both sides. The research that's going on at Oculus and even at Valve, as you can see with the pass-through camera, is about is about heading in an AR direction. And the research is happening on the cutting edge of AR, which is about occluding reality and having pixels that can block out reality, is heading in that direction. So they're just going to meet up at, I don't know what the time frame will be. And then, as I said, it'll just be categories of experiences, but not this like hard distinction that's happening right now between those two technologies.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is for all the panelists. How important is the 3D special acoustic sound effect in VR games? It doesn't seem like nobody cares at this point, but developer has to decide.
This is an incredibly important thing that isn't talked about a lot right now. So if you guys want to experience how big of a deal this is, you can go download something for your phone right now on any of the App Store, Google or iOS, called the Virtual Haircut, or search for binaural audio demo. Get a pair of headphones, plug this thing in, close your eyes, and you will experience what virtual reality for sound actually is, and it's transformative. I mean, you hear this guy walking around you and he's cutting your hair, and it's just like, I know he's there. It's just, and you open your eyes and there's not, I mean, it just blows minds, right? And the way that virtual reality did originally, that cannot be done computationally right now. There's a lot of companies that are talking about that they're working on this, and I'm sure people are working on it, but generating true binaural audio landscapes in software is basically where 3D graphics was like 20 years ago. So we're just starting to understand how to simulate how sound propagates in an environment, and incredibly complex, and what happened with computer graphics back in the day is there were several key breakthroughs that happened at SIGGRAPH and Pixar and these other places to simplify the problem down to the point where a computer could create an approximation of that thing. That hasn't really happened. There's like HRTF and this other stuff, but there hasn't been enough breakthroughs so that you can simulate that virtual haircut and create it in software. Because the way that actually works, that experience, is it's recorded with actual, like they create these foam ears and they put a microphone inside the foam ears and then they just record it. So if you turn your head, it doesn't work. You have to kind of stay still. But anyway, those breakthroughs will happen. And the first company that creates a truly accurate binaural audio simulation and software, that device coupled with virtual reality, like the ones that don't have it will immediately become irrelevant. So yeah, that's a major breakthrough waiting to happen.
Just a counterpoint to that, though I don't having experienced the haircut and spent some time working on the audio problems. There's no question. I think the comparison to graphics evolution and putting it about 20 years back is quite valid. It's astonishing how primitive real-time audio technology actually is, and how poor the research is on it, even the point where people are just barely like coming up with, as you say, correct ways to do it. Like the physics is understood, but accurate computational ways to do it in real time. It needs a Carmack of audio to come in and do it. However, that didn't prevent Carmack from making amazing games and amazing interactive experiences. Quake was, if you looked at it, it's primitive and terrible, but it was awesome. And so, the fundamental, we shouldn't get hung up on, there's definitely going to be an evolution forward of that technology, and it's going to be amazing, and no one will really appreciate it until they get their head in there and see how much of a difference it's going to make. But I don't think that's going to at all stop the evolution of, and the importance of sound, even with the limited technology we have right now for dealing with it. So I think it's going to be a slow evolution to me, rather than a radical transformation.
Yeah, I totally agree. It doesn't hold back the experiences that we're creating right now. It's just that I know that when it does come and when those breakthroughs happen, no one will look back. You won't ever want to use a device that doesn't have that after that point. But I wonder how long it's going to take. I know there are several companies out there focused on it. I wonder if some of the larger ones like the Oculus and Valve are recognizing what an important thing it'll be once it does happen.
So the second question is for Paul. The first time I played Lucky Tail was during E3 on CB1, and I thought that was cool, right? And so as soon as I got my Oculus, I started playing. And so it's like a business decision. Obviously, you have engaged with Oculus a long time ago, and also agreed to that exclusivity or pre-bundle with every headset. And when I first got my Oculus, there's just not enough quality content out there. I would have spent $30, $50 to buy your app. Now, does it justify for you to get probably a bulk volume, OEM price to paid by Oculus versus selling those in the store, at a higher premium? Is that a good business decision?
So yes, absolutely. From just a pure math standpoint, the nature of that deal for us, it was absolutely beneficial. But the other thing is the way we looked at it is when we were contemplating that deal and looking at the trade-offs, and we kind of had this whiteboard, I remember, with this math of, well, what kind of attach rate do you think we could have and all this kind of stuff. At the end of the day, we kind of realized that the market is at this place where there's still so few consumers, and there will be for the next several years, and we're trying to launch a new brand on this emerging market, and the greatest thing that we could do for ourselves to build value for Playful was just to get our brands in as many consumers' hands as possible, period. So when that deal was sort of made available, we jumped at it so that we could be, the #1 selling VR game this year, which I think will probably be what it is.
So we'll be around if you want to come ask questions, but I just wanted to thank Paul from Playful Corporation, Peter from Skydance, and Tadhg from VREAL, and I'm from Voices of VR. So thank you.